Hey, before we get to the podcast, we want to share with you an exciting new way you can help support the podcast.
Yes, we have finally opened a Patreon account. Go to patreon.com/2njb to check it out.
We have 4 different tiers, and they each allow you to support the podcast at a different level, and you get really cool rewards. So go to patreon.com/2njb and help us continue putting out great content for you.
Thank you, guys.
Let me ask you a question. If you checked showtimes for movies in your area at any given moment over the past decade, which type of movie would you almost certainly see on the list? That's right, a superhero movie. But not just any superhero movie, a Marvel superhero movie. Marvel has produced and released around 30 films since 2007, grossing almost $30 billion. But this empire of film didn't start as an empire. It all started with a man named Stan Lee. Or did it? Today we're joined by Abraham Riesman. Abraham is the author of True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. The book was published by Penguin Random House's Crown imprint and is nominated for both the Hugo and Eisner Awards. As Neil Gaiman described it, True Believer is a biography that reads like a thriller or a whodunit. It's an exploration of an often farcical tragedy, the life, afterlife, and death of a salesman, and an editor who dreamed of being something more. It unwraps Stanley Lieber, the man, and Stan Lee, the invention, and the brand name, and manages to be scrupulously honest, deeply damning, and sometimes even heartbreaking. Abraham Riesman is a Providence-based journalist writing primarily for New York Magazine about arts and culture. Abraham's work has also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the New Republic, and Vice, among other publications. We are super thrilled to be joined by Abraham today to talk about Stan Lee and all things Marvel. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, it's wonderful to be here. Quick correction.
Yes.
Riesman like Reese's Pieces.
Oh, Riesman. Okay.
I don't care. You don't need to re-record it, but just for future discussion.
Okay.
That's cool. We'll leave that bit on so people get the correction.
That's fine. Works for me.
So how did you get to write this book? Why?
Well, want the long version or the short version?
The long version.
The long version is I grew up a Marvel head. I used to first watch the Marvel cartoons that were popular among millennials in the early 90s. And then as time went on, I got into the actual comics themselves, and I became kind of an addict. I was very involved in the plots and the stories behind the scenes and the characters. And then I sort of dropped off in my interest around college. But when I became employed at New York Magazine, well, actually a little before then, I'd started reading comics again. And when I started working at New York Magazine in 2013, Marvel was really exploding in popular culture. You had the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all of these interconnected movies really kind of reaching a mainstream and critical legitimacy that Marvel had never had before, at least at that scale. And so I started writing about comic books and Marvel more generally for New York Magazine. It was the right place at the right time. And eventually one day came when, and this was, I believe, August of 2015, an editor, David Wallace Wells, walks up to my desk, plops down an advance copy of Stan Lee's comics format memoir, Amazing, Fantastic, Incredible. And he says, "You should do something with this." Now, I assumed this meant, okay, great, I'm going to get to work on a big old profile. So I started working on research and lining up interviews so I could do some large magazine profile. About a week in, I went to David, the editor, and updated him on where I was at. Before I could get far in, he said, whoa, I meant you should write a short review of this for, like a little capsule. To David's credit, he was very much on board with me continuing this profile research. So in early 2016, I published a long profile of Stan Lee with New York Magazine at their culture site, Vulture. And it was a big hit. It did very well. And within a couple of years, Stan Lee passed away. This was November of 2018. And soon after that, Penguin Random House reached out to me through my agent, asking if I'd be interested in expanding my research to write a full biography of Stan. I was at first reluctant because I'd never written a book before, and I was actually trying to transition out of talking about comics all the time. But it was too good an opportunity to pass up, and
Isn't
I
it like
dove
a
head first in.
once in a lifetime opportunity?
And the dream of like every journalist, no? Or
It is, but it's also a huge undertaking, and you can fall flat on your face if you don't do a good job. So those two things kind of kept me up at night for a few weeks, and then I just went, you know what, this is
you only
too good
live
a
YOLO. You YOLO'd it.
I YOLO'd my journalism career. Yes.
but since then you've published another book about
It hasn't published yet, but I've written. It's coming out in March 28th of 2023.
Okay.
It's a sort of spiritual sequel in some ways. It's another biography of a figure who legitimized a cultural thing that was previously seen as pure silliness, which is pro wrestling in this case. So I'm writing a biography of Vince McMahon, the professional wrestling tycoon who's behind what was the World Wrestling Federation and now is known as WWE. And it's called Ringmaster, Vince McMahon and the Unmaking of America. It's, that's the one I'm working on now.
Yeah, it looks really good.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And you said it's coming out when?
March 28th, 2023 in the U.S., which is
Stay tuned,
the Tuesday before next year's WrestleMania. So just as chaotic a release date. It was an accident. We were supposed to come out in November, and then all these shipping delays that have been plaguing the book industry led to a big reshuffle, and they gave us a new date. And I looked at the calendar and realized that it was the Tuesday before WrestleMania, which is the big sort of Super Bowl of pro wrestling. So,
yeah, that's awesome.
A little chaotic, but I'm not complaining.
No, that's good timing. So before we move on, the Stan Lee novel, I'm assuming, is available anywhere you can buy books, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's you can get it digitally or as an audiobook or in glorious print. I highly recommend the paperback edition because I corrected the one error that I made that made me horribly embarrassed, that has no bearing on the actual content of the argument or the narrative, but it just happened to be a date that I got wrong in the first sentence of the first chapter.
I see that one kept you up a few nights, I'm assuming.
That one kept me up, and finally in the paperback edition we corrected it. So I highly recommend the paperback for that very reason.
So as you embarked on this journey into Stan, most people, what do they know about Stan Lee, right? They know they know him through the cameos. I think that's the most notable. They see him as the father of Marvel and the creator of all the characters we know and love. Like for me, it's X-Men, but maybe for others, it's Spider-Man. I don't remember if he was involved in Superman or not. But what?
No, Superman is another company.
Yeah, it's DC, right? I'm not as a big comic geek. I represent the non-comic enthusiasts.
I get paid to be an expert. You don't, so it's totally fine. I'm happy to bestow wisdom upon you.
Thank you. So I guess my question is, as you embarked on this journey, what did you expect to find, and what did you end up finding out that you didn't know? Well,
I certainly expected to find a lot of lies, basically, if we're going to be blunt. What I had figured out through research for the initial article was there were enormous gaps in the truth of what Stan presented to the world regarding his own career and the careers of the people around him. There are these, I can get into some of them, but there were all of these things that are just provable mistruths. And I assumed because they were already so plentiful, once I started this book, I was going to find a lot more. And I did. Stan was a man who very regularly just either bent the truth or outright lied. Or, as he claimed, he didn't have a very good memory, so maybe every single time he was just making it up as he went along because he didn't remember or he had misremembered. I find that a little less easy to believe. But what I found was not just that. I had an interesting interaction over the phone with this other biographer, a man named Peter Guralnick, who Jewish geography, went to summer camp with my father. He wrote this 2-volume biography of Elvis, among a lot of other books. I had a phone conversation with Peter early in my research on the Stan book and said, I was just consulting him for advice. And I said, look, I have, this is in some ways an expose. There's all of these things that people assume are true about Stan Lee that are completely false, or at least deeply dubious. And he said to me, you can write that book. You could write a book that's just an expose saying, look at how much this guy lied and here's the truth. Or you can do that plus have it be a story about why did he lie and what were the impact of those lies. And how do those lies tell us something about the broader body politic? And that was some of the best advice I ever received as a journalist, because in order to sustain interest for a whole biography, you have to be saying something more than, haha, look at this guy who lied about where he's from and everything. That's just not as compelling as a story that gets more into the meat of what motivated that, and into the world-changing consequences of the mistruths that he put out there. So I'd say that's one thing where my expectation and the reality ended up being slightly different.
Can you give us maybe like the most
top 3
absurd lie that you ran into?
Well, sure. I mean, the most important one, we might as well cut to the chase, is the question of who created the Marvel Universe. In the 1960s, from about 1961 to, well, might as well say from 61 until 1970, 69, 70, depending on how you date it, Stan was working in partnership with a lot of other comics creators, creating these characters and stories that would become the foundation of the Marvel Universe. And for decades, the party line has been, well, Stan was a writer and the editor, so he must have, according to him, and we should believe him, this is the conventional wisdom, that he created the ideas for all of these characters in detail, then handed the ideas off to artists who drew the characters. But Stan would always say, I always feel like the person who has the initial idea is the creator. And, pardon me, I always feel like the people who have the original ideas are the creators, and that's me in this case. That was his whole argument, was that he was the progenitor of all of these characters and therefore the Marvel Universe. Well, unfortunately, it's not so simple. As it turns out, his primary collaborator in that period, in the 1960s, was a man named Jack Kirby. They were both Jewish, but they ended up taking very Goyish names. It was Stanley Martin Lieber, and Jack Kirby's birth name was Jacob Kurtzberg. But Jack Kirby was an artist, but he was also a writer. He was a writer-artist. He was what we in comics call a cartoonist, a full cartoonist. He could do all aspects of the comic, basically, or at least the two core elements, which is the words and the pictures. He had already co-created Captain America. He had co-created the concept of the romance comic, which was the best-selling genre of a certain part of the 50s. He was very prolific at creating new characters that took off, that people were interested in, and genres that people were interested in. And he'd worked at Marvel a bit in the 30s and 40s, and then he came back in 1958, and in 61, he's the artist on Fantastic Four #1, which is the comic that sort of launches the Marvel experiment in a lot of ways. And what's interesting is there is no evidence that Stan created these characters. Absolutely none. I'm not saying I can conclusively prove he didn't do it, but for decades, the press, historians, comics professionals have all just sort of taken Stan's word for it. But there is none. There's no hard evidence. There's no diary entries. There's no presentation boards. There's no anything like that on Stan's part. It seems equally likely, if not more likely, although again, unfortunately, because documentation was so haphazard back then, we're not going to have a real conclusive answer. But it seems equally, if not more likely, that Jack Kirby, who had created a lot of characters that had been successful, was the one who generated all of these figures, whether it's the X-Men or the Avengers or Black Panther, to a certain extent Spider-Man, although that's a complicated story. So the big question and lie and potential lie is that Stan created these characters, when in reality it may well have been that Jack, and assorted others to a lesser extent, but mostly Jack, created it all. So that's one part. Another thing that's related and is a demonstrable lie is the notion that Stan was the primary writer on these comic stories. By Stan's own admission, at length, many times, he was not writing comics from a script. He was not doing what you might intuitively assume a comics production process would be. He was not sitting down and going, okay, in this script, on panel 1, I want this to be happening visually, and these are the words that the dialogue bubbles are going to say. Then panel 2 is this. He didn't do that. He did something that was later dubbed the Marvel method, where he would have some kind of conversation with whoever the artist was on that book, on that comic book. And the artist, but I should say the writer-artist, would take that vague conversation, maybe a couple of bullet points from it, go home. They were all freelancers. He would go home and then write the story. It's just that he was writing with pictures, whoever this writer-artist would be on a given comic. More often than not, it was Jack Kirby. Jack would go and he would map out the entire story by drawing it, panel by panel by panel. He would even leave in notes in the margins saying, hey, I think the dialogue here should be something along the lines of this, or like explaining what's going on. He would then hand the pages that had been drawn, had been written, the story that had been written, to Stan, and Stan would then add in the actual language used for the dialogue bubbles and the narration. But that was the extent of Stan's involvement. He was not actually composing the narrative. He was not composing the plot beats. He was filling in what had already been implied. It's not quite as simple as that, but more or less that was that. And yet, all of these comics were credited as written by Stan Lee, drawn by Jack Kirby or whoever, or story by Stan Lee, art by whoever, when really the whoever in that question was always the primary writer and the artist. And they weren't even getting paid as writers. They were only getting paid as artists, which is just not fair. I mean, a lot of things in life aren't fair, but that's just not how we're supposed to do business.
And so
I
can
keep going, but I feel like those are the two big ones. And
I think that's super interesting. And to the advice that your journalist friend gave you, that the best piece of advice that you said that you got, why was he telling these lies?
Well, Stan, this gets into his personal biography a little bit more. Stan was a child of the Depression. He was a child of 2 Romanian Jewish refugees who'd escaped anti-Semitism in Romania around the turn of the 20th century. He'd been raised in the lower middle class, let's say. His family was okay on money, but still pretty desperate. It was the Depression. His father was a dress cutter and would just sort of sit at home during the lean years looking at want ads in the paper and seeming distressed. His father was also a difficult man, according to Stan on the few times when he talked about him, and according to Stan's brother, Larry Lieber, who I interviewed at length. Their father was a dour and judgmental man who really didn't show much love for anybody. And without turning this into too much of an Oedipus complex, there is an element of Stan's motivation that comes out of wanting to be better than his father. He talks about this in his prose format memoir of, I believe it was 2002, called Excelsior. He talks about how his main motivation in life, this is the beginning of the first chapter, is wanting to be needed by somebody in a professional monetary sense, like wanting to be successful enough that he can satisfy the needs of his family. That was kind of his driving goal. And if you come from a period like the Depression, you learn that sometimes success has to be won at all costs. And I do think, just based on Stan's own words and just my understanding of human nature, that's about as good an explanation as you can come up with, which was he was constantly anxious about losing his foothold or his handhold on the American experiment and on wealth and success. And that drove him to cut corners. He could get away with it, so he did it. And that was to the detriment of a lot of other people. You know, he wasn't a murderer, but it still was a harmful thing. And I think a lot of it came out of wanting to have security.
Some technical questions come to mind. First of all, we're talking about the 60s. There's a company, right? It's Marvel Comics, is the name?
It has all these weird names. The line of comics was called Marvel Comics, but it was owned by a company whose name often changed, this larger publishing house run by Stan's cousin-in-law, which was how he got the job in the first place, a man named Moses Martin Goodman. Anyway, yes, the company was initially the print. Yeah.
What's Stan Lee's official role, and in which company?
His official role from the 40s from basically 1941 until 1971 was as the editor-in-chief, although they just called him the head editor or the
of
editor,
Marvel Comics.
Of Marvel Comics, of the comics line at Martin Goodman's company. He was in charge of the comics there.
And did he own shares of the company?
No.
Or
Stan never owned anything. Stan was an exceptionally poor businessman and worked in a very rapacious industry where basically, unless you own the company, you have no ownership of anything. Comics is a relentlessly and despicably unjust artistic industry in America for a lot of reasons. And one of them is virtually everything you do, if you're writing for Marvel or DC, the two big companies that do superhero things, everything you create is what they call work for hire. You don't actually own any of the sweat of your brow. You're creating stuff for someone else to make money off of, and they give you a check in return. It's a little more complicated than that, in that there have been brief periods here and there where there have been agreements where creators of especially significant characters who are really good at negotiating would get like a tiny cut of the royalties. But the fact is, if you write a book, unless it's a special kind of book, generally you own the rights to this story that you create.
So
not so in comics.
So he was
an employee. He was the editor-in-chief.
Which means
he was doing the writing in a freelance capacity. Because that's the other thing about comics. All the writers and artists, they're all independent contractors. They are not actually full-time employees. They don't have health insurance. They, have to pay double the taxes, etc. And Stan often talked about this, where he'd say like, oh, well, I'm the editor and the art director. He was also that. But when I'm writing, I'm a freelancer like you guys. This would be something he would use to try to relate with other freelance writers.
Yeah.
And the fact is, he had much more job security than they ever did.
Right. But he never owned, it's not like that the credit that he did or did not take without deserving it. It's not that it's not that it helped him in owning anything, right?
No, he owned nothing.
So he never ended up taking over Marvel Comics, meaning Stanley never owned Marvel Comics or never owned any part of it.
Not even close.
Wow.
He was always an employee, and
he never
had
sued.
Power.
He never sued for.
He did sue in 2002 because he'd signed a contract in 1998 that entitled him to 10% of the profits, although you can kind of read it as either 10% of the profits or 10% of the profits on top of the profits. It's confusing. For the film and television adaptations of Marvel stuff. This was before, in 1998, there hadn't really been any adaptations that had been very lucrative, at least in film. But then they start making these successful movies. Blade in 1998, X-Men in 2000, and then Spider-Man in 2002. And Stan does this interview when Spider-Man comes out where he says, look, I haven't made a dime off of any of this, even though I have this agreement. And he went ahead and sued Marvel. And they settled. They settled for a reported about $10 million that Stan got, which I'm sure seemed like a lot of money at the time. But if you think about it, if he retained a percentage of these movies, $10 million would have been chump change for him.
Yeah.
So a controversial and perhaps regrettable decision on his part, but that was the one time that he sued.
Yet, Stan Lee was credited by Marvel, meaning they gave him this very...
They gave him an executive producer credit, but it's entirely ceremonial. They didn't pay him anything for it.
And not only that,
he wasn't getting paid as an EP. He got paid scale, as they say, like basic minimum wage for appearing in the cameos. That was it. He got paid scale. The superhero industry is horrible to everybody. The superhero industry is just a relentlessly bad phenomenon.
But why would
even for people like Stan Lee, who are the winners, you still get left behind.
Why would they cameo him in the films? I mean, isn't that just kind of setting themselves up for a claim or the lawsuit that?
No, because he'd settled. He'd settled into. I mean, initially, there was this period of the lawsuit between 2002 and 2005 when there weren't that many superhero movies, so it wasn't really an issue. By the time they resolved the lawsuit in 2005, that's when, and in fact, people often think, and I'm inclined to agree, that 2005 was they settled then because Marvel was in a rush to try and raise money to start the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which launches in 2008. So by the time the MCU starts, Stan has been like, he's okay with Marvel again. They're on good terms.
But why didn't? But why in the? Sorry, it's technicalities, but it's so interesting. But in the last years to his life, where his cameos were, a phenomenon, right? It was a must-have. Why didn't he negotiate like $1 million per cameo? Right? He
was a terrible businessman, and they would have also probably just not had him. If he asked for more money, I almost guarantee you, Marvel would have just cut their losses and said, "Okay, well,
because
no more
the fans would be angry." I think no.
The fans are the most placatable people in the world. Like I there's this myth that the fans get angry about stuff, and they do, but they always come back. Mm-hmm. Marvel has not actually really lost major viewership. It's still number one. They do terrible things. They put out bad movies, and every time, myself included in the past, we go, well, I think this is it for Marvel, or they've made a big flub this time. You saw the reviews for Thor 4. It just came out. It's apparent. I haven't even seen it, but apparently from every critic I've read, it's abysmal. It's like a terrible movie, but it hasn't affected viewership really. It's still going to be a massive hit. So you could have fired Stan Lee, and I think people would have been like, oh, that sucks. And then they would have gone back to see the next movie.
So back to the 60s again.
Please.
First of all, Kirby was alive when you wrote the biography?
Kirby died in 1994. So no, okay. I did not.
So how do we know if it was all based on conversations? How do we know that he was not a crucial part? I mean, Stan.
He may well have been. He was a crucial part in insofar as he was selling things.
No, but in the creative work. In the creative work,
he was important in that his method of writing, his style of writing, the verbiage that he chose, the words he chose were all very jazzy and syncopated and alliterative, and that's very important creative stuff. He created a voice for a lot of different characters. I don't want to minimize that. And he did sell things extremely well. Jack Kirby was not a salesman, nor was really anybody else in the industry on the scale of Stan.
Yeah.
But the reason we suspect that things were not so simple as Stan's narrative is because Jack Kirby kind of went on the war path in the 80s. He basically just decided to stop holding his tongue and started telling the press, the comics press, and anyone who would listen, that he had been the creator of these characters.
But isn't it that he said, she said?
I guess. I mean, it is, insofar as there was haphazard, like I said, documentation of everything from back then. Mm-hmm. Nobody thought these comics were going to last. It was not anticipated that nobody working for any of these companies thought this was going to be a massive cultural artifact that's worth billions of dollars. That just wasn't in their heads, really. So no one was keeping close records of any of it. So yeah, it is a he said, she said, but what people end up falling back on is looking at the comparative careers of Stan and Jack, which we didn't really get into. They each created comics from when they were participated in the creation of comics from when they were very young and the industry was being born in the 30s, all the way until each of their deaths. Kirby died in the early 90s, and then Stan died in 2018. In that time, Stan created absolutely nothing other than the Marvel universe that he's credited with co-creating, created absolutely nothing of lasting value, other than the character of Stan Lee. Name one other Stan Lee character that's not from Marvel. Stripperella is the only one anyone can ever come up with. This stripper, spy, superhero character that was just sort of a campy, joke in 2003.
Maybe it's like the Beatles, when you have your golden years in the first 2 albums, and then it's okay for the rest.
And then you make great solo records like Double Fantasy or, McCartney 2. But the thing is, Stan didn't do that.
Or Ringo Starr.
Ringo has some good stuff, but that's the thing is Stan was a little more like Ringo in that the stuff he created, even Ringo had Photograph, but or Picture Book, whatever it was called. But the point is, you have Jack, on the other hand, from when he's very young, co-creating Captain America and a bunch of other successful things. And then after Marvel, he goes to DC. Mm-hmm. And he creates this huge pantheon of characters that are all still being used, or a lot of them are at least. The most notable character probably being Darkseid, the giant evil god of darkness that is often the sort of final boss of DC stories. And that's among a bunch of other characters. Jack was just somebody who generated successful characters at a much higher rate than Stan ever did. And whenever Stan didn't have Jack, or to a certain extent his other major collaborator, Steve Ditko, he couldn't create stuff that anybody cared about.
And just to fill this gap, how and why did Stan get into comic books?
He got into comic books basically just by accident, through nepotism. When he was a teenager, he graduated from high school, did a couple of months in college, then dropped out, was doing some odd jobs. And then one day, Stan often told a version of the story where he said, I saw an ad in the newspaper and I said, wow, I should go, work at this company. And I showed up and they hired me. As it turns out, and he even changed his story later in his life, it was more that his cousin-in-law owned the company and his uncle was sort of the second in command. So the uncle one day this is according to Joe Simon, another comics creator who was there at the time, who was the editor-in-chief at the time, in fact. The uncle comes up to him and says, hey, my sister's kid needs a place to work. He's going to come in tomorrow. You got to give him some jobs. And Stan became what was known as a gopher. Gopher, as in English, you'll say, go for that thing, go for this thing, like go get me a coffee, go get me a pencil. And then he was working as a gopher for Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. It was his first interactions with Jack Kirby. And then one day, Simon and Kirby, who were not getting paid very much by Martin Goodman, decided to moonlight. They started secretly doing some comics for DC. And they told Stan, and then somebody told Martin. Stan always says it wasn't him. Jack thought it was Stan. Joe Simon didn't think it was Stan. It could have been anybody. The fact is, once Martin Goodman found out that they were moonlighting, Simon and Kirby were fired. And that meant the company needed a new editor-in-chief, a new head editor. So for a few weeks, it was one of Goodman's brothers. And then shortly after that, he appointed Stan, who was like 19 years old at the time and had virtually no experience in this industry. But then again, basically nobody had experience in the industry because it hadn't existed that long. Mm-hmm. The first Superman story comes out in 1938, and this is only 1940, 41. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that was kind of the beginning of his time in comics, was just this accident, basically. He had no interest in comics. He read newspaper comics because everybody did. But when it came to comic books, those had only been invented in 1933. He wasn't, a longtime fan because nobody was. He didn't have any particular interest in comics. And he would always talk about this in private and sometimes even in public. He didn't like comics. He didn't read comics. He made comics, but he didn't like the medium. He was constantly trying to get out of it and get into Hollywood or something else. And, it's just sort of a fact of who he was.
So maybe let's talk a bit about the character of the superhero. If you could tell us a little bit about, it does make sense that it, like in retrospect, it's this very alluring, fantastical thing that everybody wants a superpower, but it wasn't always this huge cultural phenomenon. So where did the character of the superhero start?
It was pretty much from the beginning.
Okay.
When Superman, it's gone through cycles of popularity, but Superman debuts in 1938 and is instantaneously the most one of the most successful entertainment products in America. Kids everywhere completely go gaga for this thing, and not really adults, but adults at least noted that their kids were buying this stuff, left and right. And then for the next few years, you have this glut of superheroes. Everybody who had, like I said, comic books had been around since 1933, but they'd been like different kinds of genres. Superheroes had not been invented yet, or at least superheroes as we think of them now. So once you have that debut of Superman and its success, you have Batman the next year, and then Captain America. And I mean, these are just the big names, Wonder Woman. But in reality, there were hundreds upon hundreds of these characters that were just proliferating, most of them completely forgotten by now. And since then, the superhero has waxed and waned in popularity. After World War II, there was a real drop-off in interest in superheroes, which continued for a while. And then when Marvel got big in 1961, there was renewed interest in superheroes. And since Marvel, there's never really been a complete, abandoning of comics, or rather, I should say, of superheroes. They've remained either popular in comics in some form or outside of comics, kind of since the 60s, again, with ups and downs. And I think what appeals to, there's a lot of things that appeal to us about power fantasies. But for me, what I think the most appealing sort of subconscious thing is about superheroes is the idea that you could do things and have a positive impact on the world, which sounds simple. But the fact is, we live in a world where you can't know if anything you're doing is actually a good thing or is going to have an ultimately good impact on the people around you. Superman's greatest power is that he can identify right from wrong and does the right thing. And most of us just don't have that capacity. There's something very seductive, not just about the power of the superhero, but about the moral certitude. The fact that this superhero knows exactly how to fight evil. And it's much more complicated than that. There are a whole lot of other factors, but that's one that's always sort of resonated with me and that I think has more of an impact than people necessarily realize.
And I absolutely agree, but does the I guess the archetype of the superhero go further back than 38 was.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, it depends on what you define as the superhero.
Because you have like Peter Pan, right? And you have,
sure. There's all kinds of people with fantastical powers who do good or fight crime or whatever. And you can have debates until the cows come home about, was Gilgamesh a superhero? It's sort of a useless debate in my opinion, because you can pinpoint it wherever you want just by changing the criteria. But the generally accepted date or year in which what we think of as the superhero, somebody in colorful spandex or a colorful costume of some kind, or a memorable one at least, fighting crime with abilities that are beyond those of normal people, that doesn't emerge until 1938 with Superman.
And this is in comics form in 1938?
Yeah, in comics, yeah. Action Comics #1, which comes out in 1938, is the debut of Superman.
Wow.
So what were the responses to the book?
People liked it. There were a lot of haters because Stan is a very beloved figure, and I don't pull punches in my analysis of him. But there's nothing to be done about that. Nobody has any factual problems with what I said. They just think that I didn't emphasize things they would have emphasized, or, vice versa. Mm-hmm. Stan's major protege, a man named Roy Thomas, wrote this sort of editorial knocking me down in The Hollywood Reporter. But honestly, I sort of took it as a compliment. Roy Thomas is a legend. And to have reached a point where he has to comment on this book, for me, I was honored. And I have no real beef with Roy. But, for the most part, it was received very well. It was written up. They had a 5-page feature in the print New Yorker. It was in the New York Review of Books in print. It was, I got some great blurbs. I was very lucky.
Did you get anything from his
solid seller since?
Does he have kids or?
He has one child, one surviving child. There was a baby who only lived a few days in 1950. It was 51. I can't remember. But they had a first child who still is around. a woman named Joan Celia Lee, or J.C. Lee. And she's a whole other set of questions. She, you know how I mentioned that a lot of what drove Stan was his desire to provide and to be a provider and be someone who was needed financially and materially. That really manifested itself with his wife, Joan, and his daughter, Joan Celia. They, and I hate saying this because it always sounds misogynistic on some level, but this is just based on reporting and even by their own admissions and Stan's admission. Both of them were very, well, Joan is no longer with us, JC still is. They had very expensive habits. They were both sort of shopaholics and would buy a lot and needed cash flow in order to do so. So you have Stan as early as the 60s and 70s talking about how he needs to keep working. It's always couched in a joke, but it's, or with a laugh, but talking about how he needs to make money so he can keep paying for his wife and daughter's lifestyles. And you cannot, I debated how much I wanted to get into that in the book because I didn't want to come across as just being gossipy. But the fact is, you can't understand Stan's career if you don't understand the fact that his wife and daughter needed a lot of money to keep their lifestyles going. And he made a lot of decisions in his professional life based pretty much solely on that. So JC is an interesting character.
But she's
we can talk about
she's not a fan of your book, probably.
No. JC and I had one very unpleasant 3-minute conversation interview at the very beginning of my research, which I chronicle in the book. And that was about it.
Uh-huh.
What happened on the interview? It's very I always hate telling this story on some level because she's again, reportedly, according to many people I've interviewed and according to Stan himself, she's not mentally well. Stan thought she was bipolar and schizophrenic. Very specifically, these were things that he said she was. It's not just, in a rant. He came up with these out of thin air, and other people have backed that up. She has a lot of trouble, and I don't envy her. But it's a challenge, I think, to live her life. But I don't want to get into too much detail on that.
So let's segue really sharply and
to the land of no superheroes.
Yeah,
the land of no. Hey, you got Sabra. You got all kinds of
Sabra man.
No, Sabra. Sabra is a Marvel character. Come on, you gotta have some.
Really, we have
pride in your country
there's an
here.
Israeli Marvel character. There's an Israeli
Marvel character debuted in The Incredible Hulk. She works for Mossad, and she has super strength and all kinds of fun.
Why isn't she in the movies? Why doesn't she get her own movie?
I hate to break it to you, but Israel is somewhat of a controversial subject in cinema, and I think they're probably avoiding having to deal with anybody's complaints. So no offense, but that's my guess why Sabra hasn't.
Also, I feel like, I don't know, Sabra doesn't sound like something that would kind of really go viral.
Yeah, it's very much an American naming an Israeli superhero.
Yeah.
But anyway, yes, I've taken us off track. What were you going to ask?
So you write about Israel. How like that's a completely different part of your career, basically.
It is and it isn't. I mean, I write a lot about Jewish topics, and the comic book industry was invented by Jews. It was an almost entirely Jewish industry for its first few decades. And around the time that you have the comic book industry solidifying with a lot of refugees from Jewish Eastern Europe, you have refugees from Jewish Eastern Europe and Israel really solidifying this project of Israel. That's not exactly the parallel I look at, but it's this interesting, co-evolution. And I started writing about Israel and American politics relating to Israel, which is more often what I'm writing about because I don't live in Israel. I live in America. That comes initially from having a deep family background with Israel. I wrote an article. The cat is out of the bag on this because I wrote an article about it last year. But my grandfather, Robert A. Riesman Sr., was a major Zionist activist in the United States, in New England in particular, and Rhode Island most specifically. And so Israel was kind of this important thing, although I didn't really learn a ton about it from my grandfather. And my father didn't have much interest in it, although he had lived on a kibbutz with my mother at Kibbutz Yasor up in the north back in 1977, a very interesting year to be living in Israel. But anyway, beside the point, when I started my Jewish education, I got a lot of interesting Israel information. It's sort of a typical story. I went on a free trip. It wasn't Birthright, but it was like Birthright when I was in college. But I didn't really think a ton about it. I thought in brief bursts a lot about the place, but didn't really sustain interest. And then when Trump was elected in 2016, I had this thought, which was, if I'm going to, maybe this is a break of journalistic bias, but I don't care. I was terrified of what Trump's victory meant for America and the world. And I thought, what's something I can do that can have some kind of positive impact? And what I kept thinking about was how much the similarities between the way Trump had talked about the Arab and Muslim populations of the United States and the way that fascists had talked about Jews in the past. So I sort of made this commitment to try and at least educate myself about that issue. And what I realized was, if I'm going to be a Jew trying to help Arabs and Muslims, I need to understand kind of one of the main things that keeps that unity from ever existing en masse. And that's for lack of a better word, the conflict, the occupation, whatever you want to call it. And I realized I had to educate myself. So I went on a solo trip to Israel and into the West Bank. I took a bunch of tours with both Israeli Jews and Palestinians from East Jerusalem, from the occupied territories, from Israel proper. Just tried to, over the course of 2 weeks, cram as much experience and information into my head as I could. And it was this remarkable experience that sort of set me on a path of going, look, I'm never going to be smart enough. I'm never going to be the world's greatest expert on all of this. And I don't live there. But what I can do is continue to learn and try to write about the most important dilemmas that people face there.
Do more than most of the people, I think, in America who write or express their opinions about the conflict do or did, right? Like, by the fact that you came here. I
started visiting at least once a year for a number of years. Unfortunately, due to COVID, I have not been since January of 2020 when I was reporting a story. But yes, I've made it my business to go and to talk to Israelis, and talk to Palestinians.
How did you bridge the gap between you being so terrified from Trump and the fact that Israelis love Trump?
I get why they love Trump. It makes sense to me. But Trump didn't end up really being the main topic in the articles that I was doing. That was more just the beginning, the seed that started it. As time went on, I found that the more interesting stories, because people had written about Israeli love of Trump, that's a common news topic. What started to interest me were the more obscure stories, or at least sort of narrow stories that, although being narrow, reveal a lot about the larger set of questions and the larger set of injustices. And so, when I was in Israel, I tried not to talk about Trump because it didn't seem like the conversations went anywhere.
Yeah.
So what kind of struck you when you come here? I mean, when I come
there?
Yeah.
Well, where to begin? I mean, for me, I know, boy, does it have its problems. But as somebody who grew up loving history, like to the point where I thought I was going to be an academic historian and then gave up because it meant sitting in libraries all day in college, you can't beat Jerusalem. You go to Jerusalem, and as many problems as it has, if you're going to be there as like a visitor, for me, I always find it to be, let me put it this way. My grandfather used the old line that he didn't come up with. But it was, they didn't put Jerusalem isn't holy because they put the temple there. They put the temple there because it was holy. It's just a fascinating historical place. But what strikes me, I mean, one thing that always I admire about Israelis and Palestinians is the brutal honesty that they'll have about their opinions, which I mean that. I hate the degree to which American liberals just don't say what they mean about Israel and the Palestinians and internal Israeli politics, etc. In America, you have to just speak in these lies and euphemisms, whereas you go have a conversation with the average Israeli, they'll just tell you what their political beliefs are. I mean, this is a generalization, but there's in public rhetoric a lot of beating around the bush.
They'll tell you if you don't ask, even.
What'd you say? I didn't hear you.
They'll tell you even if you don't ask.
Even if you don't ask, exactly. And I, as a journalist, that's catnip to me, because you're hearing something more honest and something that maybe you're not supposed to say in America, but that it's easier to say if you're in that strip of land.
What would you say is the most like basic thing that the average American doesn't get about the conflict?
About the conflict? Oh, geez. Man, I spend so much time trying to figure out what the average American thinks about this, because I get so deep into it that I start to lose perspective.
Let me rephrase. And the average left-leaning American.
Left-leaning American. Well, it depends on how far left we're talking, because you have, broadly speaking, the people in charge of major Jewish institutions in America, because the majority of Jews in America vote Democratic and are also very have some degree of attachment to Israel, you end up with a lot of liberal Zionism. That's the term we use here. And then you also have farther left. You have, especially among young people, a real utter rejection of Israel. And so the left is almost where you see the schism and all the mutual misunderstandings. But I don't want to make things awkward, but I do feel like a lot of left-leaning Americans who are in the liberal Zionist camp aren't honest with themselves about the set of questions that they really need to be answering. There's this tendency to talk about, well, we want peace, we want dialogue, and then they don't interrogate what those words mean. They don't ask, well, what kind of peace? Who wins this peace? Or dialogue, who's controlling the dialogue? Who gets to speak in the dialogue? And this is what I mean. My first tour guide when I was on that solo trip a few years back was a Palestinian guy who was about my age. And he talked about how he was studying at Hebrew U, and the best conversations he had were with the settler right. When he tried to talk to the center or the left even, people had trouble articulating, at least in front of him, exactly what their priorities were. It was and I find it I find it frustrating that in America we just use buzzwords rather than talking about, okay, can this land be sustainable due to climate change in 100 years? Okay, what are we going to do about the fact that there's this complete impasse on Gaza? We just sort of talk in highfalutin rhetoric here in America and don't try to get down to brass tacks and the pragmatic solutions to what's going on. And we don't talk about our ideology. We don't have people who say, look, we do, but we need more people who are honest and say, look, I value Jewish life more than I value Palestinian life, and you have to kind of choose between one or the other in a conflict. And I just wish more people would be honest about their intentions, because that would help us get to an actual resolution. Instead, we're talking in this smoke and mirrors way, and it really drives me up a tree.
I guess people are scared of being called racist or...
Well, a lot of people are racists. So, I'm not saying everybody is, but you end up with a world where people are afraid of being called racist. And so they don't really interrogate their own beliefs or what they mean or what conclusions they would lead to, So I don't want to make things too much more awkward, but
We don't mind getting awkward. We don't mind getting awkward.
Okay. You invited me on to talk about the comics, and I didn't want to
no, it's great.
my hosts, but
it's actually great. I'm interested to hear, how do you see? I mean, you've visited here. You made it a point of trying to investigate the conflict. Where do you see the conflict going? Do you see some kind of viable solution? Do you think?
I am a very.
Can you bring
pessimist.
the peace, maybe?
Yeah, right.
Or is it going to take a superhero?
Yeah, jeez. For me, what I tend to think about is climate change. I just think about the fact that in 100 years, we're all going to be diasporic populations. A lot of people who currently live in Israel-Palestine are not going to be living in Israel-Palestine anymore, because in 100 years, well, I mean, their descendants, I suppose, because it won't be very habitable just due to the larger forces that have nothing to do with the Jews or the Palestinians. So I tend to think we're going to have a relatively depopulated strip of land where people have shipped out or died. And I think that's going to be the resolution of the conflict.
Never underestimate the Israeli AC technology. It's amazing.
It is pretty nice. So I don't know. I can't predict the future, but my best hope is basically that people on both sides try to give up on the complete obsession with it has to be this land or nothing else. Just because I don't think the land, just from a pragmatic perspective, my prediction is the land isn't going to be very habitable. So we have to be thinking beyond land and start thinking about where are people going to go. Not to be too much of a pessimist, but I just tend to think we're doing absolutely nothing to mitigate climate change, and it's going to get very, very bad.
I would say that if it were going to this, like if I'm trying to go in your direction, I would say that I disagree about the land not being inhabitable. Okay. But if Africa becomes not inhabitable and we are the only land border with Africa, that might maybe threaten our existence.
I'm not even getting into all the compound threats of other because the thing is, you have desalination in Israel, so you're going to have people beating down the door for fresh water. Yeah. Right? I mean, Jordan's going to run out of water.
Yeah, we already do have that.
They're basically out already.
Yeah.
You know, it's going to be a very, very complex and difficult security situation in addition to a resource situation. And I don't envy, lately I've been doing a lot of thinking about where can I escape to. And I just don't really envy anybody who is going to be anywhere trying to live through the next 100 years. But I feel like things are going to get very dicey in Israel-Palestine. But they're always a little dicey. So what are you going to do, you know?
We're going to miss the good old days. We're going to get nostalgic about, hey, remember the conflict?
Yeah,
good times.
Hey, remember that? That was fun times compared to this. Oh, anyway, do you want to end on a more positive note?
Yeah.
Should we talk about something fun?
Yeah, like what? Do you have any?
I'm trying to think. What should we talk about?
Like, who's your favorite?
Tell us a little bit more about Sabra.
About Sabra? Oh, I'm not enough of an expert on Sabra. But here's my favorite comics Jewish Israel thing.
Okay.
My favorite thing, and I want to someday write this fan fiction story about how to fill it in the gaps, is the fact that no one remembers this. No one ever remembers this. Magneto,
that Shimon Peres was in the not Shimon. So no, right? There was in a comic book a cameo of Shimon Peres.
It may have been, but here's the point I was going to make was Magneto. Everybody knows Magneto, right?
Yeah.
Magneto is Jewish. He's a survivor.
From
what
Haifa.
Everyone forgets. Well, yeah, he goes to Haifa, exactly.
Yeah.
He ends up making Aliyah for a while. That's where he goes from the DP camp. That's where he meets Charles Xavier.
Yeah.
There's this beautiful implied story in the first issue where you get to see that background, where there's just like this triptych of panels where it's showing Charles Xavier, Magneto, and this other survivor who had been comatose, and Charles had been brought in to try and rouse her. It's the three of them just wandering pre-67 Israel and just discussing humanity and minority rights and majority rights and what do you do in a time of crisis and Jewishness, I'm sure, and Zionism, I'm sure. And that to me is the essence of what comics could be doing if it was going to be more daring.
Is there
comics is very safe, and I would love someday, I don't think it'll ever happen, to be able to write the definitive story of like, okay, so what does it mean that Magneto made Aliyah? What did that teach him? And why? And Magneto is not an entirely evil character. People love Magneto. I myself have deep affection for Magneto. But I feel like the Zionism element is something that really is interesting and pregnant with narrative possibility. So if anybody's listening and wants to hire me to do the Magneto Zionism story, I'm totally down. My idea is that he gets there and he starts fighting with one of the militias, probably the Stern Gang, I would imagine. But
is there a depiction of his, like a thorough depiction of his concentration camp years?
Yeah, there was a story that came out called Magneto Testament. I believe it was in 2009.
That would be a very cool movie.
Yeah, it was good. I don't want to diss it at all, but it was very safe. And I'm not saying it should have been more daring because it's a Holocaust story. I mean, it's something you have to be safe with to a certain extent. But I did feel like there were limits to what a mainstream comic book can say about the Shoah and about why the Shoah happened. And it felt a little bit like, okay, well, this is Schindler's List except starring Magneto. It was just sort of a kind of a boilerplate Holocaust concentration camp story, which is important, but I didn't think it added a whole ton to the larger mythos in the way that I think a story filling in some of the Israeli background.
I always
just
felt
because people don't know that history as much.
Yeah.
You know,
I always felt that Brian, I forgot his name, Brian, who made the first X-Men, first and second.
Bryan Singer.
That Bryan Singer's choice to start the first movie, which is a very important
in
movie.
Auschwitz.
Yeah. It's a
fascinating.
very good choice. It's a great scene, I think. One of the best scenes.
I wrote a whole essay for a reported piece for Vulture a few years ago about how Magneto became Jewish, because in the initial Marvel comics that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby wrote, Magneto wasn't Jewish. He was vaguely European. That was it. It wasn't until this other writer, Chris Claremont, came aboard in the late 1970s, early 1980s, that he started to have this idea of like, okay, so he's this survivor of some kind of trauma. He's European. He's about this age. What does that map out to? Oh, he's probably a survivor of the camps. And it wasn't even made canonical that he was Jewish specifically until much later. But for decades, it was pretty obvious. He would talk about how he was in Auschwitz and he lost his people. They just, for some reason, Marvel was kind of chicken about identifying religions within comics. So they didn't call him a Jew, but eventually they did. And I was really, Bryan Singer is in many ways a complete monster, allegedly. But that movie, starting with Auschwitz, I think was indeed a brilliant decision. It tells you a lot about the character and gives you a lot of perspective on why he becomes what he becomes.
And is there is there other Holocaust stories in Marvel comics?
And Marvel? Let me think for a second. What are the I'm sure there are, but it's not a common trope. It's something that's a little, it's hard to talk about. It's the Shoah. What are you going to do? There's so little that you can say in a children's story about that's going to really have the right impact. I mean, don't get me started on Holocaust education in America and how it completely dropped the ball to the point where you have like anti-vaxxers wearing yellow stars on their sleeves talking about how they're the new Jews. Holocaust education in America has been a complete abysmal failure and we need to completely revamp it. But that's a conversation for another day.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much, Abe, for coming to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Let's plug what's the pluggable things.
Sure. Yeah. Go to abrahamriesman.com, conventional spelling, Riesman. Even if you misspell it as Reisman, I registered that domain too, and it'll redirect because that's the family curse. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I tweet far too much, but it's twitter.com/AbrahamJoseph. And please pre-order my book. It is Ringmaster. You can order my existing book, Stanley, True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee, or you can pre-order my next one, Ringmaster, Vince McMahon, The Unmaking of America. You can see all of it at abrahamriesman.com.
Amazing.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Abe.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.